Okay, so I'm going to put myself in the position of someone who's out there kind of watching this, and they're going to say, government shareholder, very large public exposure, successful with like a pipeline of revenue coming through, and you know, I mean, all of the things would indicate that yes, of course, a company like that is going to have a fairly strong board and governance structure. And I didn't even mention listed company, and so therefore there's a lot of external requirements on that. What would you say to a startup founder who's out there, a smaller company, right? People that don't have the same kind of guidance or resources or requirements. How do you tie what you said around governance and specifically around profitability and revenue generation, all those other things that like they want, they have, that's the purpose of the company for them. How do you tie in governance for that person, and how would you kind of convince them that governance matters for their small companies too?
Fascinating question, and I do believe governance is important for any organisation, but I think it has to be right-sized. You know, there's no way, and I sit on the board of Hong Kong.
You wouldn't have 7 committees on a startup?
I wouldn't, but equally, if you look at the number of startup corporate governance failures that we've had, you know, from the toxic culture in Uber to Theranos peddling a...
We did Theranos, FTX, like, or even more recently, the even bigger ones with Boeing and stuff. But certainly the smaller ones, it's often the question is like, they didn't even have a board in a traditional sense. And
I think one of the big challenges with startups is you get that cult of personality. So they're often set up by charismatic individuals who have a great idea that's going to revolutionize the world and probably don't have an awful lot of patience for people kind of challenging whether or not that idea is going to work, or challenging the way in which they do things. And so I think trying to persuade them that being humble enough to sort of put a governance framework around them, just to test the way that things are being done, to make sure they've thought of their different stakeholders, to make sure they're compliant, the sort of really basic things that you need to put in place. I think, you know, you can show them what getting it wrong looks like and the costs of that, which through that you can hopefully persuade them that actually getting it right will add value for their business.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. And you said at the very beginning, and I think it's important to understand that it's the same thing when I teach ethics. Proving good governance is very similar to proving a negative, because basically it's like you're trying to show that bad things didn't happen, and it's hard to reward someone for not paying a bribe, or to reward someone for like actually showing up to board meetings or whatever. Like the basic, you know, periodic care that is required for a company to operate smoothly and to not fall into these pitfalls. And so I want to kind of come back to that briefly and just think about like, what are the few, maybe 3, 4, 5 things that you would say from a governance perspective that you think are the must-haves that are again, like the maintenance types of things? Like, what would you say are the key things that you would tell every company, like, this is what you should have?
So I think having a good board is essential, but actually a lot of them, to me, particularly when you're starting out, come from that cultural kind of space that is less the hard controls, the policies, the procedures. It's more things, you know, transparency. Are you getting transparency of information that's being reported up to the board and to other stakeholders? It's around accountability. Do you know who is responsible for making the different decisions and being accountable for those decisions when they're taken? It's around a speak-up culture, you know, people being prepared to challenge when they see behaviours that don't fit with their purpose and with their values. There's other areas like risk management where I think it's much harder to say everybody should have this, because I think if you're a startup, you've probably got a way higher appetite for taking risks than a company like MTR, for example. But having that discussion around what is really our appetite and our tolerance for risk taking can be really important. But I think getting those basics, transparency, accountability, integrity, a speak-up culture are so critically important. And when you look at Mohammed Al Fayed and Harrods recently, you know, everybody that worked in that organisation seemed to know what was happening, but nobody felt in a position to challenge the boss. And so if people did do anything, then they left, which wasn't actually changing anything because the behaviour was unable to, you know, continue for such a long period of time. And to quite catastrophic, you know, outcomes for the people involved.
Especially for the victims along the way.
And I would put that as a governance failure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I, you know, if we look at Theranos, it was fairly similar, and it was enforced through threats of litigation and NDAs and things. So I think, you know, as our friends in the legal industry, unfortunately, have been part of maybe like maintaining that culture externally. And I think there's some real soul searching that we need to do in that space as well. As kind of a concluding thought on this, I just want to you know, come back to what you said just briefly, because I think when we think of from a board governance perspective, generally speaking, Hong Kong companies have been, you know, they've done well. But one of the areas, maybe a little bit stereotypical and incorrect now, but historically has been the idea that they have been family run. They often are patriarchal in terms of the top-down structure and quite literally like male dominated companies, et cetera, with very low kind of female board rate, et cetera. But more specifically, you said that like a speak out culture. Right, and if there was one area where Hong Kong or many Asian companies tend to maybe not be marked quite as highly from a governance perspective, it's in these types of areas. And again, I'm curious with MTR, you said you have 19 members of your board. We're going to talk about diversity and how that fits in later on, but that inherently creates friction, right? If you've got 19 people, especially if you're encouraging people to speak out, then that is going to slow things down. That is going to be more challenging. And I think part of what you're saying is that challenge is purposeful and it leads to a better outcome.
Yes.
But I'm also assuming that means it's harder to get to those outcomes. And so I'm just curious, like, how do you deal with the cultural aspect of a more predominantly patriarchal top-down system where people are effectively trained to not speak out, to rubber stamp decisions of the leader, versus what you have created at MTR, which, again, is probably harder, but ultimately, you would argue, leads to better long-term results.
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think family-owned businesses in particular are fascinating from a governance perspective. You know, there's one argument that says, well, they're not terribly well governed because they're run by the majority shareholder. The board members come from, you know, his or her network, and generally his network. It's been historically in Hong Kong.
Sure.
But yet, a flip side argument to that is actually they're always thinking about the next generation.
It's true.
So they're never taking that kind of short-term perspective of what are our next quarter's results, what are our next half-yearly results, how is this business going to be around for my children?
Yeah.
And so I think you can argue it almost both ways.
Yeah.
And I think in Hong Kong, what we've seen, particularly for listed companies in the last few years, is a real drive from the stock exchange to try and change this and improve this. So as of the end of this year, we will not have a listed company which has a politely called single gender board, but which we know in reality means an all-male board. As of about a year ago, there was 1/3 of Hong Kong listed companies, 800, that were all male boards, and they will be outlawed by the end of this year. There's also a consultation exercise ongoing at the minute about further changes to the corporate governance code, really focused on enhancing the independence of board directors.
Yeah.
So a provision, for example, that after 9 years, an INED will deem to be a NED, so they can stay on the board but not as an independent director. Also a hard cap in terms of the number of boards that board members can sit on.
Okay.
So I think all of this is recognising some of that challenge and trying to overall improve the quality of governance in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I think, again, maybe not the sexiest of topics, but I think I keep coming back to the idea that these very small changes that most people are never going to hear about, or if they hear, their eyes are going to gloss over and they're just going to immediately be like, I don't even care, right? But these are the things that I think has made a place like Hong Kong competitive for a long period of time, and is going to continue to make it competitive going forward. And I think just to tie it into the kind of macroeconomic perspective, historically, it's just been overwhelmingly the case that places that emphasize kind of rule of law and have strong corporate governance, their economies do better, the people tend to live longer, better, healthier, happier lives, et cetera. And so while we may see these things as, maybe for some of you kind of legal mumbo jumbo or just things that maybe don't make that big of a difference in your daily lives, I think we need to acknowledge and understand that corporate governance is the framework upon which much of the prosperity of this past century has been built. And I think going forward, to the extent that we're going to maintain this level of, kind of shared human prosperity, I think it's largely going to be built on these behind the scenes types of decisions going forward.
I think that's right. If you don't get the governance right, you can't get the environmental and social piece right. So you have to my mind, you have to start with governance.
Yeah, great.